Deadly hello, if you're still alive, please click on the red subscribe button below the video. Gloomy viewing.
I lost my dad 2 years ago while we were out camping. I'll never forget anything about that day. It was an early morning in mid-October, the kind where the crisp chill of autumn fills the air, and the sky is just starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. As usual, Dad was up before the sun, brimming with energy and enthusiasm for our annual camping trip. "Son, get up, get dressed, and let's get a move on," Dad called from downstairs, his voice filled with the familiar warmth and urgency of our pre-trip rituals. His words were like a morning anthem, signaling the start of our adventure. My eyelids peeled open slowly as my body groggily responded to the call. I squinted at the dim light filtering through the curtains, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. "I'm up, Pops. Just gotta get my gear together," I mumbled, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Be down in 15. I knew I was lying. The truth was, I was still half asleep, my mind clinging to the comfort of my bed. But I didn't want to disappoint Dad, so I forced myself to get dressed. I threw on my jeans and a hoodie, grabbed my bag, and made my way downstairs. Dad was already outside, methodically checking the engine of our truck with the precision of a seasoned mechanic. The rhythmic clinking of tools and the hum of the engine were the soundtrack to our morning. Meanwhile, Mom was in the kitchen, sitting at the table and watching the news. The soft glow of the television cast a warm light across her face, but she was focused on the screen, her attention absorbed by the morning reports. "Dad said to send you out when you came downstairs," Mom said, breaking her concentration to glance at me. I hurried over to her and planted a quick kiss on her cheek. "Love you, Mama. I'll see you in a couple of days." Mom smiled, returning my affection with a hug and a gentle shooing motion. "Have a great trip, sweetheart. Don't forget to keep an eye on your dad." With that, I headed out the door. Dad was in the final stages of packing up the last bit of our equipment. I decided it was best to put my stuff in the truck and wait for him to finish. The air outside was brisk, with just a hint of the earthy smell of fallen leaves. It was the kind of morning that made you feel alive, full of anticipation for the adventures that lay ahead. "Son, come help me with this," Dad called out, his voice breaking through the soft rustling of the morning breeze. I walked over, my boots crunching lightly on the gravel driveway. Dad was wrestling with the last of the camping gear, trying to fit the bulky tent into the already cramped space of the truck bed. "What's wrong, Pops? You getting too old for this?" I teased, a playful grin on my face. I could see him smiling as he struggled with the tent. The banter was part of our routine, a way to make the hard work feel lighter and more enjoyable. "I'll never be too old to whoop your ass," Dad laughed, his eyes twinkling with mischief. His laughter was contagious, and I found myself chuckling along. It was moments like these that made our trip special, the easy camaraderie, the shared jokes, the sense of being a team. But then, without warning, his demeanor changed abruptly. The shift was so sudden it was almost jarring. His face, which had been animated and full of life, grew serious, his eyes hardening with an intensity I wasn't used to seeing. "Tony, if anything ever happens, son, never go camping again," he said, his tone taking on a cryptic, unsettling quality. The words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken meaning that seemed to pulse with an eerie gravity. I was taken aback by his sudden shift in mood. "What's that supposed to mean, Dad?" I asked, trying to catch his eye and gauge his expression. But he simply turned away, his attention returning to the task at hand as if nothing had happened. His abrupt change left me feeling uneasy. The lightheartedness of our morning had been replaced by a dark cloud of mystery. I continued to help him with the gear, but the strange warning echoed in my mind, its unsettling quality refusing to be ignored. I could tell that this was something deeper than a simple joke or a fleeting concern. Despite my curiosity and the growing sense of unease, I chose to push it aside, focusing on getting the gear packed and ready for our trip. The morning continued with its usual hustle, but that cryptic warning lingered, casting a shadow over the day's preparation. He acted like he hadn't just said that to me. His sudden shift in demeanor was dismissed as if it were a figment of my imagination. I continued loading the gear into the truck, trying to shake off the unease that his cryptic warning had left behind. The gear was packed with practiced efficiency, each item finding its place in the truck bed. The familiar rhythm of our preparations began to calm my nerves. Once everything was loaded, we climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, and the truck began its steady rumble as we headed out for our camping destination. Dad, as always, drove with a calm assurance that I had come to rely on. His presence behind the wheel was a reassuring constant in my life. My dad was, without a doubt, one of the kindest people I had ever known. He was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. His generosity wasn't just limited to material things. He had a heart big enough to make anyone feel cherished. His humor was infectious. He had a knack for turning even the simplest moments into something memorable. He had a way of making you feel invincible, like you could tackle anything that came your way. Yet, there was another side to him. At times, he could be quiet and distant, almost as if he were retreating into himself. I knew this aspect of him was linked to his military past. Though he rarely spoke about his service, the occasional glimpses of it were enough to understand that it had left a mark on him. Mom often said Dad came home after the war ended, but his mind is still at war. Her words were a somber reminder of the internal battles he faced, ones that were invisible to the rest of us, but deeply felt by him. Some nights, I would hear him wake up in a cold sweat, screaming from nightmares that no one else could see. Mom would comfort him, her voice soothing and steady, promising that everything was all right and that he was safe. Despite these moments of turmoil, Dad remained a remarkable man who showered his family with love and respect. He treated us like royalty, making sure that we knew how much we meant to him. As we drove to the campsite, I tried to push the unsettling conversation from earlier out of my mind. The sun was rising higher, casting a warm glow over the landscape, and I wanted to focus on the positive aspects of the trip. I was determined to enjoy the time with Dad and make the most of our annual camping tradition. The road stretched ahead of us, and with it, the promise of another adventure together. "So, kiddo, are you ready for this year's camping trip?" Dad asked, glancing over at me with a grin that was both reassuring and enthusiastic. His eyes sparkled with the same excitement they always had, as if each trip was as fresh and thrilling as the first. "Of course I am, Pops," I replied, trying to match his enthusiasm with my own. I knew I was lying straight through my teeth. At 16, I was beginning to find the annual camping trips less thrilling and more of a ritual I felt obligated to participate in. I had a girlfriend now, and the allure of outdoor adventures was starting to fade in comparison to the excitement of teenage romance and social life. But I couldn't let Dad know that. The thought of disappointing him was too painful to bear. This trip meant the world to him, and I wanted to honor that, even if it felt like a kid's game to me now. Dad chuckled, his voice carrying a playful tone. "You sure you're not upset you have to leave your little girlie back home?" He joked, nudging me with his elbow in a manner that was both teasing and affectionate. His joke was typical of the light-hearted banter we shared, a way of acknowledging the growing distance between us while still maintaining a connection. It was his way of making me feel like a part of the tradition, even as I was on the brink of moving beyond it. The mention of my girlfriend made me smile, even as I felt a pang of guilt for not being as excited as I once was. I brushed off the comment with a laugh, trying to keep the mood light. "Nah, I'm good, Pops. Just a little less excited about the whole outdoorsy thing. But I'm here, aren't I?" Dad's laughter was warm and genuine, and it made me feel a bit better. He always had a way of making me feel like part of something bigger, a tradition that was more than just the sum of its parts. It was these moments of shared laughter and camaraderie that I cherished, even if my enthusiasm for the trip had waned. As we drove further from home, the familiar landmarks of our journey began to appear: the winding roads, the tall trees, and the distant mountains. The landscape changed gradually, transforming from suburban familiarity to the wild expanse of nature. I tried to focus on the present, on making the most of the trip for Dad's sake. Despite my growing disinterest, I knew that these moments were important, not just for the memories, but for the bond they represented. I brushed off Dad's comment and let out a sigh, trying to focus on the journey ahead. Dad's laughter was a comforting sound, a reminder of the bond we shared, even as I felt my own excitement waning. He continued to drive, the truck rumbling steadily along the winding roads. The drive to the campsite took us about 4 hours, a trek that led us deep into the heart of nowhere in California. The landscape transformed dramatically as we ventured further from civilization, giving way to dense forests and towering mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Our campsite was nestled right on the edge of a cliff, offering a breathtaking view of the valley below. As I unloaded the camping gear from the truck, the sheer beauty of the setting began to overshadow my earlier disinterest. The rugged terrain and the isolation of the place felt like a sanctuary from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. However, as I worked, I couldn't help but notice a shift in Dad's behavior. He was pacing around the area, his movements restless and his mumbling barely audible. It was clear he was preoccupied with something. He kept making his way around the campsite, inspecting the surroundings with a furrowed brow and an occasional glance toward the distant trees. His demeanor was noticeably different from the easygoing attitude he usually carried on our trips. I tried to brush off my concern and focused on setting up the tent and organizing our gear. The task of unloading and arranging the equipment provided a familiar comfort, a way to immerse myself in the physical work and push aside the nagging feeling that something was amiss. An hour or so later, we had everything set up. The tent was pitched, the cooking gear was arranged, and the campsite was beginning to take shape. It was about 3 p.m. by this time, and the hunger from the long drive was starting to settle in. "Let's get down to that river and get us some dinner," Dad suggested, his voice carrying a hint of eagerness that seemed to be an attempt to shake off the unease he had shown earlier. I agreed, and we made our way down to the river. The hike was a short one, just a 5-minute walk from our campsite to the water's edge. The path was lined with thick underbrush and tall trees, their branches forming a natural canopy overhead. As we reached the river, I noticed that the cliff where our campsite was perched overlooked the turbulent waters below. The river roared with a ferocity that was both awe-inspiring and a bit intimidating. The churning rapids were so loud that their roar seemed to echo in my chest. Dad moved purposefully toward a quieter section of the river, where the water slowed and split off into a smaller creek. He explained that this calmer water was ideal for catching fish. But then, something unexpected happened. He froze abruptly, his voice trailing off. He stared into the woods with a look of intense focus, his expression distant and unfocused. It was as if something unseen had captured his full attention, pulling him into a state of profound contemplation. I watched him, concerned, as he continued to mutter to himself. His eyes were glazed over, and I could faintly hear him whispering what sounded like this last time. The strangeness of the moment unsettled me. I approached him cautiously, trying to bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between us. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, my voice tinged with worry. But he remained motionless, his attention still fixed on the dense forest beyond the river. I reached out to touch his shoulder, my fingers trembling slightly. "Dad?" I asked again, fear creeping into my voice. Just as suddenly as he had frozen, Dad seemed to snap back to reality. He turned toward me with a smile, his demeanor shifting back to its usual warmth. "The slower water is perfect for catching fish, son," he said, his voice calm and steady as he turned his attention back to the river. I was unsettled by the abrupt change, recognizing the symptoms of PTSD that Dad had struggled with in the past. His swift recovery from the unsettling moment was a reminder of the hidden battles he fought daily. Despite his attempt to mask it, the eerie incident left me feeling uneasy. "Let's get down to that river and get us some dinner," Dad said, his voice carrying a mix of enthusiasm and practicality that had always been a hallmark of our trips. I nodded in agreement, eager to make the most of our time despite the unsettling feeling that had begun to linger since our arrival. We began the short hike down from our campsite to the river, a path that twisted through the dense underbrush and over rocky terrain. The journey took us only about 5 minutes, but the transition from the campsite to the river was stark. The forest gave way to the thunderous sound of the water below. As we approached the river, I noticed that the cliff where our campsite was perched offered a commanding view of the churning waters. The river below was anything but serene. It roared with a ferocity that was almost overwhelming, its rapids churning violently, as if intent on swallowing everything in their path. The sound was as loud as plane engines, a constant booming presence that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. The sheer power of the river was both mesmerizing and intimidating. Dad led the way, moving with purpose toward a quieter section of the river where it split off into a smaller, slower-moving creek. He had always been adept at finding the best spots for fishing, and this was no exception. "The slower water is perfect for catching fish," he explained, his voice carrying a note of expertise. But then, something strange happened. Without warning, Dad's voice trailed off. His words cut short as he abruptly froze in place. His gaze was fixed on a point in the woods, his expression distant and vacant. The intensity of his stare was unsettling, and he began to whisper something to himself, though I couldn't make out the words. His eyes were glazed over, and a look of profound sorrow seemed to settle over him. The sight was both puzzling and alarming. His face, usually so expressive and full of life, was now blank and hollow. I could hear him murmuring what sounded like this last time, but the words were barely audible over the roar of the river. The sound of the water was deafening, making it hard to discern what was happening. Feeling a knot of unease tightening in my chest, I made my way closer to Dad. His demeanor was so unlike his usual self that I couldn't ignore the sense of dread creeping over me. I reached out tentatively, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. Dad remained motionless for a moment longer, his focus still locked on the forest. The minutes felt like hours as I stood there, trying to gauge what was going on. The suddenness of his change in behavior was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Finally, he seemed to snap back to reality. He turned towards me with a forced smile, his demeanor shifting back to its familiar warmth, though the ease of it felt somewhat strained. "The slower water is perfect for catching fish, son," he said, his voice returning to its normal calm and reassuring tone. Despite his attempt to cover up the moment, the eerie incident left me feeling unsettled. It was as if a veil had briefly lifted, revealing a side of Dad that was deeply troubled. I couldn't help but worry about what had just transpired, even as I tried to focus on the task at hand. The sense of foreboding lingered, casting a shadow over what was meant to be a simple fishing trip. "Dad, are you okay?" I asked, trying to pierce through the unsettling silence that had fallen between us. My voice wavered slightly, revealing the concern that had taken hold of me. But Dad remained unmoved, his body rigid and his focus locked on something unseen in the woods. I turned my gaze towards the forest, trying to discern what had caught his attention. The trees were thick and shadowy, their dark forms shifting in the fading light, but there was nothing visible that could explain Dad's sudden distraction. The feeling of unease deepened as I reached out cautiously, my fingers trembling as they extended towards his shirt. "Dad?" I said again, my voice barely more than a whisper. Just as my fingers brushed against the fabric of his shirt, Dad's head snapped around abruptly. His face was suddenly illuminated by a wide, unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The abruptness of his movement was jarring, a stark contrast to the frozen, vacant stare he had exhibited moments before. "The slower water is perfect for catching fish, son," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, steady tone. He turned his head slowly back towards the river, as if nothing had happened. But there was an underlying tension in his demeanor, a forced normalcy that did little to reassure me. The entire episode had a striking resemblance to the symptoms of PTSD that Dad had struggled with in the past. His sudden disjointed behavior was something I had seen before, but it was always unsettling to witness. Even though he had seemingly snapped out of it, the way he had twisted his head back towards the water, coupled with the eerie smile, left me feeling deeply disturbed. It was unlike any reaction I had ever seen from him. "Son, hand me my fishing pole. Let's see if we can get us some grub," Dad said, trying to shift the focus back to our fishing expedition. His request was a familiar one, a routine part of our camping trips that was meant to bring a sense of normalcy to the situation. I grabbed the fishing pole and handed it to him, my hands still slightly unsteady. As Dad prepared the equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The unsettling encounter had cast a shadow over the day, making it difficult for me to fully immerse myself in the simple pleasure of fishing. I tried to push the disquieting thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand, but the image of Dad's vacant stare and abrupt recovery lingered at the edge of my mind. Despite my attempts to enjoy the moment, the eerie encounter with Dad and his strange behavior continued to gnaw at me. It was clear that something was off, and the feeling of unease was something I couldn't easily ignore. As we began fishing, I tried to engage in the familiar activity, but the events of the day had cast a long shadow over our time by the river. I handed Dad the fishing pole. The afternoon turned into a lively contest, with us racing to see who could catch the most fish. The action was so engrossing that, for a while, I managed to push the unsettling episode from earlier out of my mind. Each time I reeled in another fish, a sense of accomplishment and normalcy washed over me. Dad's laughter and playful jabs added to the fun, making it feel like any other camping trip. We fished for a couple of hours, and it felt like we had caught every fish in the river. The sheer number was impressive, and our competition had turned into a lighthearted sport. The day was filled with the familiar sounds of our camaraderie and the natural world around us. Despite the shadow cast by earlier events, I was doing my best to enjoy the moment with my dad. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, we headed back to our campsite. The evening light gave everything a golden hue, and the cool air was a refreshing change from the heat of the day. Once we were back, we set to work on preparing our catch. We scaled and gutted the fish, expertly skewering them on branches to cook over the campfire. The smell of grilling fish soon filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. Dad retrieved a beer from his cooler, settling down on a nearby log with a piece of wood and his pocket knife. He started whittling, his movements methodical and soothing. The rhythmic sound of the knife carving through the wood was a comforting background to the crackling fire and the murmur of the river below. I stood on the edge of the cliff, looking out over the river. From our vantage point, it was clear that the drop was steep. I'd estimate we were about 75 feet above the churning water, but the height only added to the feeling of isolation and grandeur. I picked up a rock and threw it down into the river, watching as it disappeared into the frothy depths with a satisfying splash. I turned back to Dad, my mind still preoccupied with the strange episode earlier. I wanted to talk to him about it, to understand what had happened and why. But as I approached, the fear of triggering his PTSD and the uncertainty of how to broach the subject held me back. I hesitated, unsure if I should bring it up or let it go. Dinner was ready, and we sat down to eat. The fish was delicious, a fitting reward for our efforts. We ate and chatted about the day, trying to keep the conversation light and upbeat. Despite the earlier creepiness, the evening was pleasant, marked by the comfort of our routine. After dinner, Dad took care of cleaning up the dishes while I gathered more wood for the fire. By the time I finished, it was around 8 p.m., and the sky had darkened considerably. We were both winding down, ready to relax after a long day. The night promised to be quiet, and the crackling fire was a welcome source of warmth and light. As the darkness deepened around us, the earlier unease seemed to fade, replaced by the familiar sense of contentment that often came with the end of a day spent in nature. But even as I tried to relax, the strange events of the day lingered at the back of my mind, a nagging reminder of the unsettling moments we had experienced. "How was your dinner, son?" Dad asked, his voice warm and casual as he finished his meal. "It was awesome, Dad. Thanks for cooking," I replied, trying to sound cheerful and appreciative. Dad gave me a thumbs up and returned to his whittling. The knife slid smoothly over the wood, and the soft glow of the campfire cast flickering shadows on his face. Despite the pleasant atmosphere, my mind was still troubled by earlier events. I took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to address the troubling incident. "Hey, Dad, what happened to you on the river today?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. Dad looked up from his whittling, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. "You froze up, Dad," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "And you repeated something you just told me." Dad's face shifted from confusion to agitation. "Froze up? What are you talking about?" His irritation was evident now, and I could tell that he didn't want to discuss it. I felt a pang of guilt for bringing it up, worried that I might be prying too much. "It was nothing, Dad." "You must not have heard me," I said quickly, trying to defuse the situation. Dad's demeanor softened a bit as he tried to reassure me. "I haven't been sleeping very well, that's all. Don't worry about it, okay, son?" His tone was calmer now, but the tension lingered in his eyes. He gestured towards his sleeping bag, a signal that he was ready to turn in for the night. "I'm gonna hit the hay, son. I'll wake you up early in the morning so we can go hunting," he said, his voice more relaxed. "All right, good night." "Love you, Dad," I said, attempting to keep the mood light despite my unease. Dad nodded and disappeared into his tent. I watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and lingering worry. After he was settled, I remained by the fire for a little while longer, trying to process the day's events. The fire's warmth was comforting, but the strange episode earlier and Dad's cryptic remarks kept swirling in my mind. Eventually, I made my way to my own tent, trying to push aside the unsettling thoughts that had been plaguing me. I crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping that a good night's sleep would help me forget the odd occurrences of the day. But sleep didn't come easily. The day's events, particularly Dad's strange behavior, continued to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness. The night was eerily quiet, with only the distant sounds of the forest and the occasional crackle of the dying campfire breaking the stillness. As I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I forced myself to focus on the comforting routine of our camping trip, hoping that tomorrow would bring a fresh start and answers to the unsettling questions that had arisen. He disappeared into his tent, and I followed suit, retreating to my own. The day's activities had left me exhausted, and I fell asleep quickly, hoping for a restful night. However, my sleep was abruptly shattered by a sound that jolted me awake. It wasn't just any scream, it was a harrowing, agonizing scream, one that pierced through the darkness like a knife. It sounded as if someone was being tortured, and the sheer terror in that cry made my heart race. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. The scream seemed to echo in the stillness, but as soon as I moved, it ceased. The sudden silence was even more unnerving. The usual night sounds, the chirping of bugs, the crackling of the campfire, the constant rush of the river were all gone. The absence of these familiar sounds made the night feel oppressively empty and unsettling. With a trembling hand, I slowly unzipped the flap of my tent, peeking outside. The moon cast an eerie glow over the campsite, illuminating the forest in ghostly shades of silver and shadow. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their shapes distorted by the moonlight. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with anxiety, but the need to check on Dad pushed me into action. I climbed out of my tent, the cold night air biting at my skin, and made my way toward his tent. My steps were careful and deliberate, each crunch of gravel underfoot seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. When I reached Dad's tent, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I unzipped the flap slowly, peeking inside. The interior was dimly lit by a faint light that filtered through the fabric, and I could make out the silhouette of Dad's sleeping bag. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. There was no response. I unzipped the tent a little more, sticking my head in to get a better view. The sight inside was unsettling. Dad was sprawled out on his sleeping bag, but his movements were erratic, as if he were struggling with some unseen force. I called out again, louder this time, "Dad, are you okay?" My voice wavered with a mix of fear and concern. I reached out to shake his shoulder gently, trying to rouse him from whatever nightmare he was trapped in. There was no answer, only the sound of Dad's mumbling, a mix of incoherent words and frantic whispers. His eyes remained closed, and his face was contorted with distress. The scene was unsettling, the kind of vision that seeps into your soul and lodges itself there, refusing to leave. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I wanted to wake him, to pull him out of whatever he was experiencing, but I was paralyzed by fear and confusion. The scream from earlier, combined with Dad's strange behavior, created a nightmarish tableau that I couldn't escape. Feeling helpless and terrified, I stepped back from the tent. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around me, and I could hear the soft rustling of leaves as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets. The only thing I could do was wait and hope that Dad would wake up soon, or that whatever was haunting him would pass. "Dad, are you okay?" I said, my voice trembling with worry as I peered into the dim interior of the tent. Inside, the only sounds were my father's muffled, unintelligible mumblings. It was clear he was caught in some kind of troubled dream or internal struggle. His muttering seemed to form a fragmented conversation with himself, and I could make out bits of phrases through the haze of confusion. "You can't take them. They're my family," he whispered urgently, his voice strained and desperate. The atmosphere in the tent shifted abruptly. Suddenly, a new voice emerged deep, guttural, and chillingly alien. It was as if the voice didn't belong to my father at all. It resonated with a dark, almost demonic tone that sent shivers down my spine. "I will take you, then I will take them," it growled. I felt a cold wave of fear crash over me. My legs felt weak and unsteady, and I stumbled backwards, falling to the ground outside the tent. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a drum. I was paralyzed by shock and horror, the surreal experience overwhelming my senses. As I lay on the cold, uneven ground, Dad's voice pierced through my terror. "Tony, are you okay?" he asked, poking his head out of the tent with a look of genuine concern. I scrambled to my feet, brushing dirt from my clothes and trying to collect my thoughts. "Yeah, sorry, Dad, I was just checking on you," I managed to say, though my voice betrayed my anxiety. Dad's gaze was steady, but his eyes held a trace of confusion. "Are you okay, Dad?" I asked again, needing reassurance that he was all right despite what I'd just witnessed. He nodded slightly, a gesture that should have been comforting but only added to my unease. "I'm fine. Just go back to bed," he said, his voice now softer and more tired. Despite his attempt to reassure me, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. The voice I had heard, the tone of menace, it was as if something malevolent had taken hold of him, or, at the very least, something sinister was lurking just beyond the surface. With a lingering glance back at the tent, I headed toward my own, my mind racing. The scene inside Dad's tent replayed over and over in my head. Was it a manifestation of his PTSD, or was there something more disturbing at work? I didn't have answers, only a growing sense of foreboding that gnawed at me. As I crawled back into my sleeping bag, I couldn't escape the sense that something was profoundly wrong. The usual night sounds were eerily absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to amplify my fears. Sleep came reluctantly, if at all, as my thoughts were consumed by the unsettling events of the night. The remainder of the night unfolded in an eerie calm. Despite the jarring events that had occurred, I found myself lying in bed, trying to process what I had witnessed. I replayed the disconcerting scene in my mind over and over, attempting to find a rational explanation for what had happened. As the hours ticked by, I came to the unsettling conclusion that what I had experienced was not merely a symptom of PTSD, but something far more disturbing. The next day dawned bright and clear, yet I couldn't shake the heavy weight of unease that clung to me. We went about our usual routines, hiking through the dense forest, casting our lines into the river, and gathering firewood for the evening. Despite the peaceful surroundings, Dad remained unusually distant. He was quieter than usual and seemed to be carrying an underlying irritation that I couldn't quite pinpoint. As the day wore on, I tried to put aside my worries and focus on enjoying our time together. We joked about past camping trips, and Dad's laughter rang out, albeit less frequently. I observed him closely, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cheerful, easygoing father I knew and loved, but there was an unmistakable tension in his demeanor. Despite my internal conflict, I refrained from broaching the subject of the previous night's strange occurrences. I was unsure whether it was a matter best left undisturbed, and I couldn't risk further unsettling him. By evening, the sky had turned a rich tapestry of orange and pink, signaling the end of another day. Dad prepared for bed, his movements deliberate and slow. He seemed to be lost in thought, his earlier irritability giving way to a quiet resignation. "All right, son, I'm out," Dad said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Love you, Pops." "See you in the morning," I replied, not realizing that these would be the last words I'd ever speak to him. Dad gave a nod and a tired smile before retreating into his tent. I watched him go, a lingering sense of foreboding tugging at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, but I pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just my anxiety over the previous night's events. As I prepared for bed, the earlier tension seemed to dissolve into a reluctant acceptance of the day's end. I tried to relax, telling myself that it was just another night in the wilderness and that we would sort everything out in the morning. The world outside was tranquil, the only sounds being the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Little did I know, as I drifted off to sleep, that this would be the calm before a storm far more terrifying than I could ever have imagined. The night was setting the stage for a series of events that would change everything, and the finality of the day's goodbye would take on a heartbreaking significance in the days to come. When I finally settled into my tent, the darkness enveloped me, and the anxiety that had been simmering beneath the surface began to creep up my spine. The memories of the previous night haunted me, replaying in my mind with relentless precision. I knew I needed to calm myself, but the unease was overpowering. I took deep breaths, trying to push the unsettling images away, and reassure myself that it was just a figment of my imagination or a result of stress. Then, a sound pierced the silence, a grotesque, squelching noise that I could only describe as the sickening squish of bones and flesh. The noise was distinct and unmistakable, carrying through the still night air. I tensed up, my heart pounding in my chest as the noise grew closer, heading towards the cliff that overlooked the river. I felt a surge of panic and forced myself out of the tent, the chill of the night air biting at my skin. In the eerie quiet, I scanned the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the unsettling sound. As my eyes adjusted to the low light, the silhouette of a figure emerged against the backdrop of the cliff's edge. It was unmistakably my father. He stood perfectly still, his posture rigid and unnatural. The way he was positioned, gazing down at the churning river below, sent a jolt of terror through me. I gasped, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the sight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Summoning every ounce of courage, I sprinted towards the edge where he stood, my heart racing with fear. I closed the distance quickly, but as I reached about 10 feet behind him, something froze me in place. The sight before me was beyond comprehension, a nightmare made flesh. I could finally hear what he was whispering, though the words were barely audible over the rush of the river. His voice was strained, trembling with a desperate intensity. Each word was heavy with a dark, unsettling tone. "You can have me, but not them," he muttered, his voice breaking. His face was turned downward, his eyes glazed and unseeing, as if he was speaking to something or someone far beyond our reality. The sight of him so detached, so mournful, was profoundly disturbing. I could hardly believe this was the same man who had been laughing and joking with me earlier. Every instinct told me to intervene, to pull him away from the edge, but the terror of the scene made me hesitate. It was as if the very essence of the night had frozen me, holding me captive in a state of dread. Before I could react further, the reality of the situation hit me with full force. My father's behavior was no longer just troubling. It was a harbinger of something far more sinister. The feeling of impending doom settled heavily on my shoulders as I realized the gravity of what was unfolding. "This is the last time you hurt me," my father whispered, his voice quivering with a mixture of desperation and resignation. "Dad, are you I began to call out, but before I could finish the sentence, my father abruptly turned his head. His eyes, hollow and dark, locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. "Never agree to go camping again, son," he said in a voice that was not quite his own. The words carried a weight that seemed to press down on my very soul. Before I could react, before the full comprehension of his words sank in, he took a final step forward. He leapt. N-O-O-O-O-O-O-O-O-O-O-O-O. The scream tore from my throat, raw and anguished. The sound of my own voice, echoing through the night, barely masked the roar of the river far below. The sheer, unadulterated shock of witnessing my father jump from the cliff left me paralyzed, as if time itself had stopped. The world around me seemed to blur into a haze of disbelief and horror. I stumbled to the edge of the cliff, my legs barely able to hold me. My mind was racing, trying to process the enormity of what had just occurred. I peered into the abyss, but all I could see was the black void and the relentless churn of the river far beneath. There was no sign of my father, no trace, no evidence of what had just happened. As the numbness began to wear off, the overwhelming grief and terror hit me like a tidal wave. My chest tightened, and I felt the cold sting of tears streaming down my face. The reality of the situation of my father's disappearance, of the horrifyingly unnatural circumstances, settled heavily on me. I needed help. I needed to get away from this nightmarish place and find someone who could assist me. I ran back to the campsite, my movements frantic. I fumbled with the keys to the truck, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The engine roared to life as I threw the truck into gear and sped away, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of fear and desperation. The drive back home was an agonizing blur of darkness and endless road. The headlights of the truck seemed to cast long, ghostly shadows, and every flicker of movement in the rearview mirror made my heart leap in terror, convinced I might see my father's face staring back at me. The 4-hour drive felt like an eternity. Every mile seemed to stretch on forever, and my thoughts were a jumbled mess of regret, confusion, and panic. I could swear I glimpsed my father's silhouette in the back seat more than once, though each time I turned, the seat was empty. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the truck and my own ragged breaths. When I finally reached home, the first thing I did was rush inside, bursting through the door with a sense of frantic urgency. My mother, who had been waiting for me, looked up in alarm as I stumbled into the house. I could barely form coherent sentences as I explained the horrifying events of the night, my voice cracking with emotion. She stared at me in disbelief as the gravity of what I was saying sank in. Her face paled, and the weight of my words seemed to crush her. She collapsed into tears, her sobs mingling with mine as the reality of the situation became undeniable. Together, we called the authorities, but despite their best efforts, no trace of my father was ever found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no evidence of his presence behind. The search was exhaustive but fruitless. My father was gone, and the memory of that night, of his final words and actions, became a haunting specter in my life. 2 years have passed since that fateful night, and the trauma has left deep scars on my psyche. As the annual camping trip approaches once more, I find myself grappling with the fear and uncertainty that has become an inescapable part of my life. She collapsed and began to sob uncontrollably, her grief overwhelming her as the reality of what had happened settled in. We called the authorities immediately, and they launched a search that spanned days. They combed the area around the cliff and the river below, but despite their thorough efforts, no trace of my father was found. It was as if he had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the darkness of that night. His disappearance left a gaping void that nothing could fill. That was 2 years ago. I've since turned 18, and the annual camping trip has come around again. I haven't been back to that site or participated in the trip for the past 2 years. After the incident, I moved away to escape the haunting memories, and it felt like a necessary step to start over. But now, I'm heading back to stay with my mom for the weekend, partly out of obligation and partly to face the lingering shadow of that fateful night. The night I arrived at my mother's house, it was clear that she was still deeply affected by the loss. We greeted each other quietly, and after a subdued dinner, we both retreated to our respective rooms. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken sorrow and the weight of unresolved grief. Later that night, as I lay in bed trying to calm my racing thoughts, a sudden chill crept up my spine. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The room was eerily quiet, save for the unsettling silence that seemed to suffocate the air. I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake, and that's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint and chilling that it made my skin crawl. "Son, get up," the voice murmured through the darkness. I sat up abruptly, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. I rubbed my eyes, trying to dispel the remnants of sleep and fear, but when I looked toward the window, my heart nearly stopped. There, at the bottom of the window, peering in with an almost unnatural stillness, was a face. More specifically, it was my father's face. His skin was a ghastly shade of white, almost translucent, and his hair was matted and unkempt. His eyes, dark and void of emotion, stared back at me with an unsettling malevolence. They were not the eyes I remembered. They were cold and empty, lacking any trace of the warmth and love they once held. As I stared, paralyzed by fear, he began to speak in a deep, guttural tone that seemed to echo from the darkest recesses of the night. "Won't you come and join me, son?" he whispered, his voice dripping with a chilling, almost otherworldly quality. "It's been so lonely here. Come to the edge, where you belong." The sight of his face, twisted by something beyond comprehension, and the horrifying tone of his voice left me frozen in terror. The room seemed to contract around me, and the walls felt like they were closing in. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was trapped in my throat, rendered useless by fear. "Dad," I managed to croak out, though my voice trembled and wavered. "What's happening?" Why are you here?" His face remained still, eyes fixed on mine as he continued to speak in that disquieting tone. "The cliff awaits us, son. You can't escape what's meant to be. It's time for you to join me, to end the torment." I struggled to understand, to grasp the full meaning of his words, but all I could think of was the horrific truth of that night, my father's last moments, the eerie circumstances surrounding his disappearance, and the unshakable sense of dread that had plagued me ever since. Desperate to escape the nightmarish vision, I turned away from the window, my mind racing. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the room was illuminated, the face was gone. The silence returned, but it was heavy with the weight of what I had seen. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I needed to get out, to find answers, to confront whatever was haunting me. But as I looked around the darkened house, the echoes of that night seemed to follow me, a constant reminder that some shadows never truly fade away. "Son, are you ready to go camping?" The voice came again, disturbingly familiar yet grotesquely altered. It was my father's voice, but something was terribly wrong. His hand, with long, sharp fingernails, tapped rhythmically on the window pane. The sound echoed through the stillness of the room, each tap sending a jolt of terror through my spine. I could hardly process the sight before me. His face, pallid and unrecognizable, pressed against the window, seemed to shift and contort in ways that defied logic. His eyes, once kind and warm, were now black and hollow, devoid of any humanity. "I've missed you all this time, son. Why did you leave me?" His voice was laced with a sorrowful intensity that felt both pleading and menacing. The words twisted in the air, mingling with the eerie tapping of his nails. His mouth began to stretch open wider than anything I'd ever seen. His cheeks split grotesquely, tearing from the corners of his mouth to his ears, his jaw dislocating and hinging open in a nightmarish gait. The sight was beyond comprehension, a visual abomination that seemed to mock reality itself. Panic surged through me as I jumped out of bed. My mind raced to make sense of what I was witnessing, but the more I tried, the more the horror seemed to amplify. His eyes, those dark, hollow pits, tracked my every movement, following me with a predatory focus. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling uncontrollably. Every step felt like it was dragging me deeper into a waking nightmare. I reached for the light switch, desperate to dispel the darkness and the sinister presence that lurked just beyond the glass. As the light flickered on, the grotesque image of my father vanished in an instant. The window, now clear and normal, revealed only the calm, ordinary night outside. I could hear nothing but the usual sounds of the house's distant creaks, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of the wind outside. The sudden shift from terror to eerie calm left me disoriented and breathless. I couldn't stay in that room, not after what I had just seen. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled from my room, my mind racing to understand what was happening. Without a moment's hesitation, I dashed down the hallway and burst into my mother's room. "Mom!" I gasped, my voice breaking with fear and urgency. "Mom, wake up!" Something is outside, and I saw Dad's face. My mother stirred, her eyes opening with a groggy confusion. As she took in my panicked state, her expression shifted to one of concern. My mother sat up, her face paling as she tried to process my words. "Oh, God!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not again." I tried to explain, but the words came out in a frantic jumble. I saw Dad's face, and it wasn't right. He was tapping on the window, and his mouth it was stretching, tearing. My mother sat up, her face paling as she tried to process my words. "Oh, God!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not again." "What do you mean, not again?" I demanded, but she didn't answer. Instead, she got up and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkened backyard. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my voice. She turned back to me, her face etched with a mix of sorrow and fear. "There are things we don't understand, son. Sometimes the past comes back to haunt us in ways we can't explain." Confusion and dread filled me as I stared at her, trying to grasp the meaning behind her words. The fear I felt was overwhelming, a visceral reminder that some things, once they touch the darkness, never truly let go. In the midst of the terror, one thought persisted in my mind. If my father's presence was indeed connected to the darkness that had overtaken our lives, then confronting it might be the only way to find peace for both of us. "Mom, are you awake?" My voice trembled as I shook her gently. She stirred, her eyes blinking open with the haze of sleep. "Yes, I'm awake, son." "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "Mom, we need to leave right now. Something is outside," and I began urgently, but she cut me off abruptly. "He can't get you, son, if you don't agree to go camping," she said, her tone strangely detached as she rolled back over and closed her eyes. "Mom, what the hell is that supposed to mean?" I shouted, my frustration and fear boiling over, but she simply ignored me, sinking back into her sleep. Confusion and anger overwhelmed me. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Did I really just see my dead dad's horrifying face at the window? I couldn't stay inside. The fear gnawed at me, demanding action. If I didn't get to the bottom of this, I'd never be able to sleep again. With a deep breath, I decided to step outside and confront whatever was lurking in the darkness. The cold night air hit me as I stepped into the backyard. The woods behind our house were shrouded in an eerie, oppressive darkness. I made my way to the side of the house where my window was, scanning the area for any sign of the horror I had just witnessed. The backyard was quiet and still, with only the distant rustle of leaves whispering through the trees. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the dense forest, stretching endlessly into the night. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the area, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The silence was almost worse than the fear. It felt heavy and suffocating, as if the night itself was holding its breath. As I stood there, frozen by uncertainty, a voice called out from the depths of the woods. It was faint at first, barely audible over the gentle night sounds. "Won't you go camping with me, son?" The voice said, sounding distant yet chillingly familiar. I stopped dead in my tracks and slowly turned towards the source of the voice. The words were laced with a pleading tone that twisted my stomach. I peered into the darkness, trying to discern where the voice was coming from. "I'm gonna get you, just like I got your dad." The voice erupted into a piercing screech, filled with malevolent glee. The sound cut through the night like a knife, sending a jolt of terror through me. The voice was filled with a ghastly triumph, as if it was relishing in the fear it was causing. I staggered backward, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. The voice, so sinister and familiar, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the woods in a twisted game of cat and mouse. Desperation clawed at me. I needed to get away from this place, but the thought of returning inside and facing my mother, who seemed to be lost in some cryptic understanding of the situation, left me feeling helpless. The screeching voice continued to echo in my mind, a relentless reminder of the terror that had gripped my family. My father's disappearance, the grotesque vision of him at the window, and now this ominous threat. It was all too much to bear. With a final frantic glance at the darkened woods, I turned and hurried back inside the house. My legs felt weak, and my mind raced as I tried to process the horrifying encounter. I needed answers, and more than anything, I needed to protect myself and my mother from whatever darkness was lurking in the shadows. As I entered the house, I knew one thing for certain: this nightmare wasn't over, and it wouldn't end until I confronted the source of the terror. Just then, a figure emerged from the woods, bright white and completely naked, moving on all fours. Its movement was jerky and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. The figure began to scream horrible, guttural screams that pierced through the silence of the night. The sound was so primal and unearthly that it felt like it was clawing its way into my very soul. I fell backward, landing hard on my ass, and instinctively closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst. The screams grew louder and louder, an agonizing cacophony that seemed to close in on me from all directions. My heart raced uncontrollably, and every muscle in my body tensed in fear. Suddenly, I felt long, cold fingers wrap around both of my ankles. The nails dug into my calves with a ferocity that made me flinch in pain. I could feel the weight of whatever was holding me, the chill of its touch sending shivers up my spine. This is it, I thought in a daze. The thing that had claimed my father was now going to claim me and my mother. In the midst of my terror, my father's last words echoed in my mind, "Never agree to go camping again, son." The memory cut through my fear like a lifeline. I snapped out of the paralyzing terror and mustered every ounce of courage I had left. IMOTGOING, CAMPINGWITHYOU. I screamed at the top of my lungs, my voice cracking with raw emotion. My hands covered my eyes as if trying to block out the horror. The screaming abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. Slowly, I pried my hands away from my face and looked around, expecting to see something grotesque or horrifying. But there was nothing. The figure was gone. The woods were silent, and the night seemed eerily calm. At my feet lay a small wooden cross, intricately carved with the words Father and Son. It was the same cross my father had whittled during our last camping trip. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. The sight of it brought a flood of emotions, grief, relief, and a profound sense of connection to my father. I clutched the cross tightly, feeling its comforting presence. I didn't know if I was going crazy or if this was all a twisted reality. But I did know one thing for sure: I would never go camping again. The horrors of that night had shown me the darkness that lay in wait, and I would do everything in my power to avoid it. With the cross as my talisman and a newfound resolve, I made my way back inside the house. My mind was still racing, but I felt a strange sense of peace knowing that I had faced the terror and survived.